So thank you everyone for making it to the webinar. Thank you for joining today's webinar, so hosted by Culture Solutions. I'm Elise Cuny, I'm the chair of Culture Solutions, and I'm really delighted to welcome such a distinguished panel of 4 experts who have significantly contributed to the field of EU international cultural relations, both from a theory and a practical point of view. I'm here with my colleague Atakan Budaci, who's doing an Erasmus traineeship with us at Culture Solutions, and who was really helpful in making this webinar possible. So today we will discuss the important new handbook, the EU as a global cultural power, that was released earlier this year and coordinated by Mafalda Dâmaso. And so we're honored to have with us Mafalda, along with four contributors to the publication. We have Avril, Joffe, and Matina Magkou, who co-authored the chapter The Payer, the Piper, and the Fairness Tune on EU-Africa cultural cooperation. And we have Andrew Murray and Alessandro Lamonica, who co-authored the chapter Enhancing the Theory and Practice of EU International Cultural Relations. Before we dive into the discussion, just a few practical points. The webinar will last 1 hour, so until 6 p.m. We'll have a Q&A at the end. We'll try to dedicate at least 15 minutes for the Q&A. So if you have questions that come as we discuss, please, you can already type them in the chat. Atakan will help collect the questions and, if necessary, prioritize some. And the session is being recorded and we'll then make it available on our YouTube channel, as well as in a podcast format, so through different streaming platforms. And a quick word about Culture Solutions for those who don't know us yet. So we were funded in 2018 as a non-profit social innovation group dedicated to advancing the understanding of culture in European Union external relations and of ICR more broadly. Our mission consists in producing knowledge, informing policy making, and creating spaces for learning, dialogue, and trust building. We inform and support a diverse community from policymakers to cultural practitioners and private sector stakeholders. And the local cultural actors' voices are central to the research that underpins our analysis and thinking. And of course, none of this would be possible without Culture Solutions Network. And I see many members joining us today on the call. So hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. So once again, a warm thank you to our speakers and to the audience for being here. And I'd like to start by letting Mafalda a chance to introduce the handbook. So Mafalda, can you tell us about the origins of the handbook, the idea behind it, and the goals you aim to achieve in advancing the field of ICR with this handbook?
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me and for having us and for the invitation as well to present the book at Culture Solutions. I think that's really wonderful. And I really look forward as well to the conversation with everyone who has joined us. The European Union as a global cultural power is a handbook that really emerges out of the contributions of its authors. And the issues around cultural exception, cultural globalization, diversity of cultural expressions are, of course, key in across these different chapters. These are ideas that are revisited, but they're also brought forward in another direction. And so if you could just put the next slide. I would like to simply have the names there. So if you could just, yes, that's absolutely fine. I want to really highlight the names of the contributors and the importance of their work. I had the idea of putting together this book, but then, of course, that I contacted people. There was an open call, and the result is a book that looks at culture in foreign policy and development, looking namely at EU-Africa cultural cooperation, as at international cultural relations, as we'll hear now, but also looking at capitals of culture, at cultural sustainability, and then looking at media and trade as well, at issues from the importance of Europeanism in Mexican culture, Latin American supranational media policy, also at ACP cultures or ACP Culture Plus, and the circulation of European film, and the digitization of external cultural policy. And we also have a foreword by Professor J.P. Singh, for which I'm very thankful. And so this book, if you could go on now to the next slide, I'm trying to be as quick as possible so we can save time for our conversation. The book really emerged out of a certain tension, something that I found quite interesting with ongoing discussions at the time, but that also was in tension with my knowledge of international cultural relations. And in particular, discussions of the Brussels effect in Skype calls with Andrew Murray many years ago led me to think that the EU's global cultural action was different. But this was only a hypothesis, of course, that later on the chapters could demonstrate. And so this first idea that was really relevant when I put together the proposal was that the EU has an effect around the world. And Anu Bradford in the Brussels effect suggests, however, that the EU is a regulatory superpower without having to cooperate with non-EU actors. So that lack of cooperation was in tension with what I knew of international cultural relations. And the other interesting idea an idea that I found interesting, but that also did not fully match somehow some conversations around international cultural relations and the role of culture in the world, was that of the EU as a normative power. And here I'm referring to the idea of the work of Ian Manners, and by which, as it describes, the EU is or was a promoter of norms which displace the state as the center of concern. So the idea that shared values, then human rights, for example, that sustainable development, all these ideas have displaced the state, and that the EU promotes those norms. But we all know that this idea has been criticized and seen as no longer relevant, to say the least. And I mentioned several reasons why in the introduction. And I understand that. But again, at the same time, I still saw in my own work in international cultural relations a certain continuity between the idea of, or the proposal, or the understanding of the EU as a global actor that emerges out of this work, and then what I saw in international cultural relations. And so these two key ideas, whether the EU cooperates or not, and then the presence or the importance of norms, these were the two ideas that I wanted to test. And so if you could then pass to the next slide, thank you. And in fact, when all the chapters came up or came back, these ideas were confirmed. So that is, the idea of the centrality of collaboration was confirmed across chapters. Of course, that always with some limitations, as we'll hear, and there's work there that can be improved. But this is transversal. And the second thing as well was the importance of norms or values. And I have to say, this is an academic book. So when I wrote to those who then became authors, and when I exchanged emails with people who responded to the calls online, I was writing as an academic, and so I was agnostic, right? I was not writing as a citizen. I was saying, let us know what you find out. So if what you're finding out goes against these ideas, that's what we have to read and to know. But that was not confirmed. Yes, there are many challenges, limitations, there's work to be done, but the EU is really supporting the value of cultural diversity and other values around the world. However, in a way that is quite different from the idea of a normative power, in the sense that the implementation, or the way how the EU strengthens the idea of cultural diversity, the way how it strengthens it, boosts it, the governance that accompanies this kind of work is one that it results in something that is not static. So it's really about sharing power. It's really about enabling something else outside or beyond of the EU. So there's something quite active there that is different from saying strengthening values such as human rights. So those values are central, of course, but there's something really active and future-oriented. And I'm hoping to write a more academic paper that thinks about these issues in terms of international relations. And so the summary really is that the EU, out of these chapters, emerges as an enabling power. And I have to open up a short parenthesis here to say that as I was working on the introduction, I was also co-editing a special issue. And one of the articles was written by Patricia Kaczynska, who talks about the enabling role of culture. So culture as an enabling asset. So anyone who's interested in creative economics and those discussions, I'd also recommend reading that article. And so the idea is that the EU is, through its global cultural action, beginning to emerge as an enabling power that supports cultural diversity around the world. And this was, as I have to say, and to finish, not something that an idea with which or an idea that I asked authors to write about. I mean, this was a working hypothesis based on my own research, but it was confirmed, and I have to say even reinforced when I read the work that I received. So I want to thank authors for the contributions as well, because without them, this book and this analysis would, by definition, not have been possible.
Thank you, Mafalda, for this rich introduction, and we can really feel the excitement and the work you put into coordinating such a handbook. So thank you for that. So I mean that's great because you actually anticipated one of the first questions that I had, and I'm just gonna jump into that question and ask first Andrew, then Avril, and Alessandro to address it. So the question is this one: what makes it relevant in the current context to talk about the EU as a global cultural power? I also asked this question. I realized that I didn't give a chance to the co-panelists to introduce themselves. So please, as you answer this question, introduce yourself too. That would be really wonderful. So Andrew, if you want to start by addressing this challenging but necessary question.
Sure, yes. So I've worked in the field of ICR for a long time, first with British Council in Africa and several weeks in Europe, and then for EUNIC from 2015 to 2018. And I was involved in the joint communication and the subsequent development of the strategy. I agree with Mafalda that to see the work of the EU in the world as an enabling power fills a gap, actually, because I think Tamas Such did mention that in a recent article, that he thought there was a lack of a coherent global vision in terms of the objectives of the EU ICR approach. And I think thinking of it as an enabling approach, an enabler, really, for cultural diversity around the world, that's a great way of looking at it. However, it's still a matter of potential rather than practice. And I think what we do, Alessandro and I, and he'll comment on this, and he's much more involved in practice now than I am, is that although there's potential, there's very much little evidence on the ground, apart from perhaps European spaces of culture, that there is anything happening to fulfill that vision of the EU as a global enabler. And that's partly to do with the geopolitical situation, and particularly what's happened in the last 6 months. But it's also, I think, a matter of a lack of leadership within the EU and internal divisions, and the contrast between how culture is treated internally and externally. Mafalda and I have spoken about that. Okay, I'll hand over to others.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's a hard analysis indeed, but a very relevant one. So Avril, please, the same question addressed to you.
Thank you, Elise. So my name's Avril Joffe. I'm from Johannesburg in South Africa, and that really shapes how I think about this. And in the chapter that Matina and I wrote, we spend more time, I think, speaking about the tensions and challenges and contradictions of the idea of Europe as a global cultural power. And I agree with Andrew that there's more potential in the words than there is reality. And in fact, there's a lot of criticism about even the concept of Europe as a cultural power, because it seems to suggest that no one else is a cultural power. And Africa wants to assert itself as a cultural power too. And, you know, its agenda, the AU Agenda 2063 is very clear about its Pan-African vision as a rich and exciting continent that is very cultural at its heart. And the evidence and the practice of Europe in Africa, and it's difficult to separate Europe from the member states, to be honest. You know, as much as there's very clear direction given to Europe to act by itself, the experience, the practice on the ground is through the members, through the member states, really, and the experience of the member states. So I think the tensions that emerge in this vision are more apparent than the reality of Europe as a global power, as a global cultural power. And I think on the continent of Africa, there are very big competitors for that, such as China and so on. And Europe often is now seen as reinforcing post-colonial reflexes and, the experience of Europe, because it's got such a long history on the continent with the colonial powers, means that it is sometimes, I think, the contradictions that emerge are more apparent. Because people expect better, people expect more, people expect Europe to actually really hold on to its power to enable culture to do the work that culture does. And Europe doesn't have the monopoly of cultural diversity at all. The diversity on the continent is always seen as much stronger, much more robust, much more alive than the diversity, the cultural diversity that Europe claims to be supporting. Now, I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you, Avril. So, I mean, in that sense, even the handbook title is a bit controversial, because talking about EU as a global cultural power should not exclude other cultural powers, of course. Alessandro, if you can as well address that question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Elise. Thank you, everybody. I'm Alessandro Lamonica. I'm in the middle, in between academy and practice. I manage the Public Policies Unit at the Anna Lindh Foundation, which is an intergovernmental organization that works for intercultural dialogue in the Euro-Mediterranean region, but I also teach cultural and public diplomacy here in Brussels. And so when looking at your question, let's say I found in it a certain ambiguity, which I think maybe was not done on purpose, but it's reflective of the ambiguity of the role of the European Union in matters that refers to culture and international relations, because you refer to global cultural power and what is this relationship with the current context, the context of, say, the international environment. So I would say that we can interpret it in two very different and diverging directions. Of course, if we refer to global cultural power, then indeed we are in a power competition framework. And yes, the current environment is very much conducive and open to approaches that rely on soft power to win this competition. So if the question is the current environment favorable to power competitions that relates to culture? Yes, indeed it is, because we are going back to power competition at the global stage with the crisis of multilateralism and cooperation. So if we think of the role of the European Union as an actor that is capable of using culture for soft power purposes, then indeed there are some entry points. But whether this is in line with an intercultural relations approach or not, it's debatable. And in my understanding, it is of course not. And we go in the other direction. If we think of the European Union and the global cultural power, but as a power that is enabling principles of international cultural relations, they go against power competition. International cultural relations, in theory, should be more related to elements of deliberation, of participation, of cooperation, of co-ownership. And of course, we are going in a very different direction. So it depends on how we interpret the definition of global cultural power. If it's soft power, indeed, the current environment is is a friendly one. If it is non-transactional, cooperative, and collective, then of course the current environment is not a good one, and we are in troubled waters. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandro. No, it's very clear, and indeed, I mean, that's the whole point of this discussion, is also to test, the relevance of the framework today, and see what needs, what challenges and what inadequacy are to be addressed if that framework is to be kept in the future. So I'm gonna really jump into the tensions that we've already evoked a bit in that first question. A question to you, Andrew and Alessandro. So your chapter is really on the tension between theory and practice and how you reconcile the two. And I would like to ask you, so now we are, 9 years after the 2016 joint communication for EU ICR. Do you anticipate a continuation or a clear disruption of this framework? And I feel we've already touched a bit upon that, but I'd like to really, dig even more into it. And so do you anticipate a continuation or a disruption of the framework, and notably in relation to other more strategic frameworks that we see today in EU's external action? And I'm obviously thinking about the Global Gateway. Andrew, I'm going to ask this question to you first.
Sorry, Lisa, but is Matina going to say something about her? No, not at the moment. Okay.
Not yet.
Not at the moment, maybe in a while. Thank you, Andrew.
Okay. Yeah, theory and practice. There isn't really a theory. That's the problem. And Alessandro and I have been working on this in a couple of articles. And what we are working towards is the suggestion that theory is basically largely based on practice, particularly the practice of two cultural institutes, the Goethe Institute and the British Council, over the last 50, 60 years. At the heart of this emerging theory are the two principles of mutuality and reciprocity. And the why is all about the global public good, about the common good. And following on from Alessandro, this is really why the theory and the practice of ICR at the moment is in such dire trouble, because we are in a world of soft power. I've been working over the last few years, each year doing a comparative study of soft power around the world. And increasingly, the soft power is largely devoted to the achievement of national goals. That's the heart of soft power, not climate change or inequality or tackling pandemics, the global public good. So, following on from Alessandro, we're in a very difficult period. And the tension between theory and practice is that the practice, particularly of the EU, in terms of how it delivers its ICR, there's very little happening on the ground. Global Gateway is largely a geopolitical instrument for achieving EU interests, not the global public good. Okay, there is very little understanding at the highest level in EU management of what ICR is all about. So there may be a couple of pages about ICR on the EAS page, on the EAS website, but in terms of practice, the delegations are not practicing ICR; they're practicing stratcoms. And the work with EUNIC, which was potentially the way forward to create Europe houses through the European Spaces of Culture, that has virtually died, frankly, in terms of practice. So I'm sorry to be a great pessimist about this. I think the only way forward is from the bottom up, is through work through organizations like Cultural Solutions, through civil society itself, rather than relying on a top-down approach at the moment. Okay.
Thank you, Andrew. Just briefly to come in and maybe let as well Mafalda react on that. I also feel that the purpose of the handbook is precisely to show that EU's ICR is more than what it was described strictly in the strategy. So Mafalda, you've analyzed, as well. You looked into private sectors. You looked into rising CCIs for EU and its partners. So, do you feel that's also the way out, in a way, to bridge at the end strategy and reality, is to look at actually what's happening, the success among private sector and civil society?
Yes, if I will answer that question, but I want to highlight or to respond to the discussion before on power. So the question is, I think, or can be, what is power for, right? And yes, the EU has power. Yes, other regions have a lot of power too, absolutely. But the question that I think emerges as quite interesting, looking at the book as a project that in which I worked and we worked for a few years now in the past, is that while other regions are, as Alessandro mentioned, and Andrew as well, and Avril, while other regions are increasingly aiming to concentrate their power, right, and to fight in a really zero-sum logic, the work that the EU has been doing in beyond its borders in the cultural sphere follows another logic. And when one looks at international cultural relations projects, this logic is evident, but it's also, and here I jump to your second question, Elise, it's also present when one looks at the circulation of European film, when one looks at the digitization of EU external cultural policy, when one looks at capitals of culture. So I think that while recognizing absolutely the problems, the limitations, the lack of top-down direction, leadership that has been mentioned, I do think that when we do look at the ground, what's happening, and when we look across sectors and not just at the way how international cultural relations is defined in a strict sense, we actually see movement emerging in another direction that suggests that different actors recognize, yes, the power of the EU, but see it as something that can be used to, from the bottom up, reconstruct a different way of working and opening up the way to focusing on the common good. So yes, I recognize that other actors, even within the EU, EU policymakers, may have a different understanding of cultural power, one that might be very different from what we're discussing. But that does not mean that this different understanding of power as something that is shared, right? Power as leverage is not happening on the ground as well. And so while we do need to be very realistic about what's happening, and I appreciate Andrew's comments, I also think that we should not lose sense of that work that is not as loud, but that has been happening.
Thank you, Mafalda. Alessandro and Matina, if you want to comment on that question too.
Please, Matina, if you want to go first.
Just maybe, I mean, with Avril, we also position ourselves between evaluation and practice. And I think I would like to bring this as well in terms of how international cultural cooperation and the role of soft power actors like the European Union is evaluated, and what is also the language that we use and the narratives that are transmitted through evaluations. I think with Avril we have been having this discussion very often, especially when it comes to fair evaluation and how international cooperation occurs. I don't know, I think I maybe bringing back to the notion that we've raised in the topic that has to do with our chapter, that has to do with fairness. I think this is also something that maybe will come out in the conversation in the future, in a few seconds.
Thank you, Matina. Alessandro, you want to add something on that?
Yes, very, very briefly. Listening to Andrew first and then Mafalda and Matina, I would like to stress an element that we've been working for a while with Andrew, that is this tension between theory and practice, and also the element of practice theory that we tackle in our chapter. Thinking of your question, Elise, there is a tension indeed between theory and practice, but this tension has always been there, it will always be, and I believe it is beneficial. Why? Theory brings a normative approach, the cascade, a normative cascade, we could say, that somehow impacts practice. Then to what extent it impacts practice, it depends, of course, on the case studies, but in principle, we do have values, then values inform principles, principles inform norms, and then norms have an impact on policy, and then we need to check what are the consequences in reality. So I'm perfectly fine with the fact that there is a tension between theory and practice. There will always be. There are many theories as many practices and different visions of reality, and they are in competition. Now, the question, I think, is how much the theory of international cultural relations or the principles underpinning it are able to influence tensions that are present in reality, in our reality. So the role of culture and international relations. And there we know, we have been studying, all the panelists have been working on that for many years. There is a tension between a public diplomacy versus international cultural relations approach to the role of culture, a tension between member states and Brussels when it comes to the governance and funding system, a tension between center and periphery. So what is the center, whether it is Brussels or a capital, what's the periphery as our strategic partners, a tension between the governmental actors and the non-governmental actors. So these elements of tension in reality are there. The capacity of the theory, of the principles of international cultural relations to impact positively these elements, I believe, is weakening a bit. And just 1 minute and then I will be done, because of elements that are more systemic. So we know that there is a crisis of the international liberal order, a crisis of multilateralism, a democratic backsliding. This democratic backsliding is undeniably affecting the way we see international cultural relations, because the way we see international cultural relations is basically a democratic understanding of the world. If democracy has been eroded, as a consequence, the effectiveness of this approach is also weakening, some could say. But at the same time, and to end on a positive note, I also agree with what Matina, Avril at the beginning, and Mafalda know each other, so I'm not called you by your surname. So regarding the fact that international cultural relations as such are mostly a practice. So elements that are practiced by a community that is not really the management or the governance in Brussels or in the capitals, but it is bottom up, that is much more spread, that is networked, that is made of a multi-stakeholder approach where the private sector and the civil society are there. It's very much grounded. And so it can survive the negative consequences of power competition in international relations as such, because international relations is no longer the privileged field of action of governmental and intergovernmental players. We have the private sector and we have the non-governmental one that can play a role in rebalancing this let's say, negative understanding of international relations. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandro. No, it's very interesting. So from hearing you, I see that you can almost say there is tensions within the theory, and then on the side, what's happening concretely in the field. And the question is about who's acknowledging what in advancing the theory. Moving a bit away from the strategy, let's say the higher policy level, I'd like to go a bit more regional and ask a question to Avril. So Avril, your chapter with Matina is on Africa-EU cultural cooperation. You already touched a bit upon that in the first question, but what are the perceptions in Africa about EU as a cultural partner? And I understand that EU is not always perceived as the EU, but also as the sum of member states. And in asking that question, I also want to go back to, and that's very interestingly set in the handbook forward, that the EU has built as well is international cultural relations around the notion of cultural expressions diversity. And actually, has the EU ever had or retained this image of promoter of cultural diversity in Africa, and more specifically in South Africa, where you are, Avril? Thank you.
Thanks. I think this is such a fantastic conversation, and we should have more of this, because in my mind and also in the practice in the field and from the actors in the field who are recipients and beneficiaries of international cultural relations, there is no doubt that there is a willingness and a desire to have these relations, these cultural relations between African organizations, artists, communities of artists, organizations, and Europe. And that not only that there's a desire and a willingness to have them, there's a need for them. Not only because there's a sense that Europe has developed the ability to have funds because of the colonial project and therefore owes Africa something, but also because there's a sense that this produces the desired effects of opening up space for dialogue, for a diversity of voices to be heard on the continent, public space to share ideas and to enlarge people's understanding of themselves, right? So having said that, there's no doubt that when money is the source of the relationship, which it typically is, that just highlights and in a way manifests into the real sense that there's asymmetries of power, that the global world is deeply unequal, and that Africa remains dependent on the funds in order to have the kind of cultural diversity and public space for culture that it needs to have, partly because our own governments are not putting in sufficient funding and have not taken seriously the project of culture, the idea that culture is something that needs to be invested in, that there needs to be cultural infrastructure, that there needs to be cultural funds, that there needs to be funds to host public debate and dialogue. And so the European funds are seen as absolutely vital because they help stimulate that kind of intercultural dialogue. They stimulate spaces for culture to happen. So that's why that quote is on the page. It's a really important comment that Matina and I wanted to make, because in all the criticism that we were highlighting and the tensions and the contradictions, we were not wanting to suggest that there should not be a relationship and there should not be a partnership, but that had to be fair. Then there needed to be fairness, as Matina already said, fairness in that relationship. There need to be a sense of equals participating in that relationship. And I think the biggest example of the inequity in that relationship is the way in which the EU sees itself as a global cultural power, and in the way that it sees the AU, its partner on the continent, as a global cultural power. The AU's position is very clear. It's a pan-African organization with a pan-African vision for culture and cultural diversity to be made manifest, and to ensure that all the regions of the continent can speak together with one another. But as we know, European funding is very circumscribed around sub-Saharan Africa, and that the North African region is contained within the MENA region, and therefore often those relationships and that ability to have a joint voice is just undermined. And it's almost that people are saying, well, does the EU not respect the AU? Does the EU not respect the vision that the AU has put forward of a pan-African continent? So that's just at the very largest level. I think at the more meso level or the organizational level, the issues become one of are those partnerships that are being developed and those those cultural relations being developed, is it between equals? Is it only between European funding bodies and the elites in the society who happen to speak one of the colonial languages, who are educated, who are urban-based, who've got access to the internet, who've got Wi-Fi, and therefore can relate on some level of equality? What happens to the diversity of voices in our own society of the people who are not those people, who are not the urban educated elite? It's about who is in the room, who is allowed, enabled to participate. So I think some of these are the issues that have come out very clearly in all the conversations Matina and I have had, not only with one another, but with the people that we work with on the ground in various African countries. And I think, having said that, I think there are examples of practice from Europe that are suggesting a different way forward, such as the European Spaces of Culture for Sub-Saharan Africa. I must disclose that I'm a jury member on that Spaces of Culture, so I'm involved with the group, and there's such a real recognition of the need to embody more fair principles into everything that EUNIC does, in the sense that long ago they commissioned Matina and I and a couple of other colleagues to do a toolkit on creating more fairness in the relationships and helping EUNIC members really struggle through positionality, privilege, a decolonial understanding, and all the things that are necessary to have a more equitable relationship. And I must applaud EUNIC for having done that, because that has been used everywhere. And in the Spaces of Culture project, it's a foundation on which the partnerships between African organizations, creative organizations, and cultural organizations have had to make those relationships, partnerships with local EUNIC members. That fairness toolkit is the foundation of that relationship. So I really think, and the Spaces of Culture are really looking to have ownership and agency in the African context. And I think there's so much, I know it's a later conversation that we can have, but I think the practice of the European Space of Culture for Sub-Saharan Africa, I think, is going to shape the theory as well, and that's what practice can do. Practice can help question what the theoretical views are. This whole idea you started off with, Elise, of culture as a public good. We know this is a big debate in the world at the moment, and Mondiacult is meant to be considering culture as a global public good, and that dropped off the agenda. It's now considering culture in its relationship with the SDGs, and we are in a really difficult moment politically, where, as Alessandro was saying, there's a pull back from democratic ideals. There's a rise of right-wing nationalism. There's a breakdown of the multilateral conditions, and in that context, culture is always going to fall off the agendas. And it's our job as cultural practitioners, cultural experts, cultural academics, writers, and so on, to always put it back on the agenda so that it doesn't slide off. And not just culture, but what is culture's role? What is culture's role in society? And yeah.
Thank you, Avril. No, and I really hear you. And it's true that fairness is a perfect example of how a concept was actually emerged from really the practice and the bottom-up approach, because it came as something that was obvious that had to be implied, and now it's entering as well the wording used by cultural practitioners and cultural organizations. The challenge is, how do we keep it there, and how do we keep amplifying it? Turning to another region of the world, you mentioned North Africa. Now we're turning indeed to the MENA region. I would like to ask a question to Alessandro. So Alessandro, as part of your work, obviously with the Anna Lindh Foundation, you're very close to the field as well, and to civil society and cultural actors. It's also a strategic moment for the MENA and the Euro-Mediterranean relations at the moment, with the Pact for the Mediterranean under discussion, under consultation. But it's also come obviously with challenges in the regions, obviously an ongoing war in Gaza, political divisions, EU member states not agreeing on positions to take, and also perceived lack of EU credibility, especially due to weak responses to Israel's actions in Gaza and the occupied territory. So, I mean, I guess you must be really on the front line of seeing all that and all the contradictions that can emerge from this partnership. In light of these realities, how do you see the evolution in the understanding and practice of cultural relations between the EU and the Mediterranean partners?
Thank you, Elise. I'll try to be very concise. But this is, of course, a complex matter that derives from this tension between our ideas and how these are translated into policy frameworks, and then how a policy framework is actually reflecting of the actual situation on the ground. These three levels, they interact in complex ways, especially in the Euro-Mediterranean area. That is, I think, the epicenter of complexity. Now, on October 16, the College of Commissioners should adopt the new Pact for the Mediterranean. The Foundation, as many other actors, civil society, intergovernmental, and governments, participated, contributed humbly to this process. We know that there will be a pillar on people-to-people relations, that this pillar will have a dimension related to culture, that this dimension related to culture will tackle elements mostly revolving around the notion of cultural heritage, tourism, sport, education, research cooperation. So it is there. There is a commitment, not only on paper, then we will see after October 16 what is actually there, but there is a commitment on the side of the hierarchy of DG MENA to invest on cultural relations. They understand the relevance of it. The Director General is Stefano Sannino, was previously at the European External Action Service, who knows what international cultural relations are expected to be and the difference with other concepts, such as public diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, and how it relates with soft power. And this is very relevant. So to have interlocutors in policy making that understands the notions behind a certain framework is key. Without that, we easily fall into a complete divergence between the relation, the facts that are happening on the ground and what happens behind the closed door in Brussels. So we have this understanding. We have this commitment in the pact. The pact should then turn into tangible actions, even though budget is still a question mark. So it is there to stay. There is a renewed commitment to it that was already there in the new agenda for the Mediterranean of 2021. But then I would like to raise, let's say, a red flag on that, because then there's always the reality check. So in end of October, the pact will be out, but a pact that is based apparently on multilateralism, that acknowledge the role of culture, will have to tackle some old enemies, such as the lack of new foreign policy. So the fact that we have several foreign policies that are moving from multilateralism to bilateral relations. So in reality, they will probably contradict the multilateral spirit of the new Pact for the Mediterranean, starting from day one. Second, the domestic situation in national politics, as Avril was mentioning, the rise of right-wing nationalism and ethno-nationalism in many European countries, that is a trend that will not stop for some years now. Their understanding of the role of culture in society, because member states play a very relevant role. The national elites are going to influence what is actually international cultural relations among countries in the Euro-Mediterranean. So it is at that level, I think, that the most relevant impact will take place on the successful implementation of the Pact for the Mediterranean, because it's a pact among countries, and there, of course, the communities. So this is also relevant to consider. Their idea of culture, I think, is a culture that is the further and further politicized, securitized, weaponized, very much against the democratic understanding we have on international cultural relations. And last but not least, and then I will close, the Pact for the Mediterranean, even though acknowledges the role of culture as an element of unity and cohesion, and the role of civil society and the relevance of education and research, but it's very much focused on economic development, migration seen as a security threat, and the need for increased safety and stability. So we live in a trend that is diverging from the understanding of culture that will be in the pact. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alessandro. Keeping an eye on the clock, and obviously I didn't keep my promise, and I'm sorry about that. I said we would have 15 minutes Q&A, and now it's already 52. So I would like to suggest to open now the Q&A session. I had more questions, and I can keep those if the audience is out of question, but I really doubt it. So I would like just to open. I see some people already wrote questions in the chat, but please just you can raise your hand and ask the question directly. That can be nicer and more interactive. So yeah, let's start receiving questions. Looking who has who raises his hand. Oh, I see a question from Felipe. Or is it, Felipe, is it a question or just a comment? Okay, it's more a comment.
It is both, but let me just introduce myself, Felipe Basabe, as a member of Cultural Solutions and one of the co-founders, but also a practitioner, as I am responsible for finance at Instituto Cervantes for a long time. And I was very much involved in EUNIC in some years ago, but in the last years, we have other priorities. We have to do with budgetary restrictions and digitization, which is basically what national cultural institutes are doing. And this is what I mentioned in my question comment. And when Avril said that the theory, could be more or less dead, ineffective, forgotten, practice is shaping the theory now. And it is low-scale projects mostly digital with local communities, what we see now that have a really preponderant effect and are actually bringing up new ideas and new fora for real dialogue. The traditional instruments and strategies that we have, let's say, funded along traditional lines are no longer effective at all. But something else is happening. And I could give you lots of examples from the Arab world, from the African world, from the Latin American world, where a new emergence of a need of fora and spaces for dialogue is coming up because the need to build trust is there. And there are new options, cheaper options to do it, which ends up being much more effective. That was it.
Thank you, Felipe. I see Mafalda, you want to react, and I think Andrew as well, you wanted to react to that.
Yes, if I can just start. Again, I absolutely recognize the problems, limitations, underfunding of the sector, the systemic, as Alessandro mentioned, trends that go in another direction. I absolutely see this. I am I'm not pretending that that's not the case. At the same time, I also want to defend academia if I can, and to say that academic thinking, can also open up or help to open up new avenues to develop international cultural relations. And so I'll give an example that I know, but there are other people who are developing work in different directions. I'm working on a project around film, and quite a few things will be published in the next few months. And one of this project has done several things and looked namely at the way how non-EU film professionals look at the EU. And Avril has worked with me. We have worked on this in terms of to understand the way how South African film professionals see the EU. And long story short, one thing that we're doing in this project is to look at film and co-productions as an example of international cultural relations. This is something that originally was not thought through or was not present in the way how the international cultural relations was developed. But if we look at it as a framework for cooperation that includes actors at multiple levels, then there's no reason not to look at co-productions potentially as a way to extend ICR. So this is just one example. It's just to say that please don't abandon academia and give us a chance to contribute, because we can as well. I know this is not what you were saying, Philippe. It's a bit provocative, but it's just to say that theory can also contribute, I think, to advancing the field at a time when that advancement is not coming from the top down in terms of policymakers, let's say.
Can I just follow up from what Felipe said? I totally agree. We've just done a survey of comparative survey of 25 countries work in soft power, but mainly looking at cultural institutes. What's very interesting is that digital strategies are achieving lower per capita costs. So there's a move to digital strategies and away from traditional instruments. So, for example, British Council is probably going to close around about 20–30% of its offices overseas. And there are cuts in other national cultural institutes frameworks overseas as well. What they're doing is focusing on particular regions. If they're still using physical structures, for example, Australia looking at the Indo-Pacific, a lot of other countries are looking just at the Indo-Pacific and closing down other operations. And it's interesting when you look at new innovation in terms of traditional cultural diplomacy and public diplomacy, the Global South is not going down the road of cultural institutes at all. They're going straight to digital. That's the way forward. And I also think try and end on a positive note, because I've been too negative. I realize I have. I think what Cultural Solutions is doing in terms of developing a community of practice is what Alessandro and I recommend as the way forward at the end of our chapter. And that sort of change is going to be generational, actually. It's not going to happen in the next 3 to 5 years. And it's a matter of training and education and professionalizing the practice of international cultural relations. That's got to be the way forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. Avril, please come in.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are all absolutely vital comments. I wanted to pick up on the one question, which was about, the ways in which the right wing are responding to culture and do respond to culture and weaponizing culture, instrumentalizing culture. And I think that's why we are particularly also concerned when we do the same thing, when we instrumentalize culture, when we focus, for example, on the culture and creative industries and talk about how important it is for jobs or for employment or for foreign exchange earnings or for building small and medium businesses, and the focus on cultural entrepreneurship, which is coming through a lot of cultural institutes and agencies. We are then guilty of the same thing. That is not the role of culture. And we need to be very mindful in the work that we do, that we don't fall foul of trying to adapt to the priorities of member states in the ways in which we think about what we should be funding and the cultural cooperation that comes out of it. And Elise, if I can just reference the project that you guys were working on, that I was working on with you, on cultural cooperation, the role that cultural cooperation can play in developing the skills basis for the future culture and creative industries of Africa. We found that, yes, digital, very important, Felipe, I think really important comment. And especially where digital programs allow for a more expansive program, a slower paced program, not so intense, 3 weeks or 1 week of training and it's done, but a program that allows people to come in and out, to share ideas, to themselves develop a community of practice in the same ways that Cultural Solutions developing a community of practice. It's a key priority on the continent for creative and cultural actors to develop their own communities of practice based of similar like-minded people across borders on the continent. So I just wanted to mention that because I think it's, as Andrew said, we must finish on a positive note here. There is a role for cultural cooperation. There's a role for international cultural relations. And by doing the academic work, Mafalda, we highlight the challenges and we hopefully improve how those partnerships and programs develop.
Thank you so much, Avril. And I see we're reaching the end of our webinar, but I just want to, leave this open question and let a chance as well to other panelists and maybe some participants from the audience to respond to that. The last question I had prepared for this webinar was what more could be done or what could be done differently to defend the framework and the values of fairness and trust that actually underpin international cultural relations. And so when I ask what, it can come from EU institutions, it can come from cultural actors in the field. And so I would just like to leave that as an open question to all and allow for both the panelists and the audience to answer. So voila, here is my question.
Maybe my contribution just follows up on what Avril said. I think that, I feel very privileged to have had this opportunity supported by the European Union to be in dialogue and directly on the ground in spaces like in South Africa with Avril or in other projects. And that's why I bring in this need for auto-reflection that we also mentioned with Avril in our chapter, like the need to also consider our own positionality when we do this kind of work. Where do we position ourselves? Where is our privilege now as researchers, as Europeans, or coming from a smaller European country or a bigger African country? So this need of reflecting on our own level that is also highlighted in the toolkit that we have mentioned, like this need to reflect on our own practices on the personal level, then on organizational level, and then we might be able to influence the policy and the meta level.
Thank you, Matina. And anyone else wants to come in on that last question before the closing word? Mafalda, maybe?
Hi, may I come in?
Yes, of course, yes.
Hello, everyone. Sorry to have joined in late, but I think the last couple of contributions that I've heard have kind of triggered me to come in and have a conversation. I think the timing for this conversation is really important. I'm just zooming in and thinking about, political spaces that come between, particularly talking from an African and European perspective, where we see the cooperation between Europe and African countries become much more closer. So we're just not talking trade, we're just not talking migration, we're also not just talking development, but we've also been talking about people. And in many of the spaces where we see, at least from the Africa side, where there's a cooperation, there is often a people-to-people exchange that is really about people and that centers on, the respect, sort of looking at the relative senses of people in places of giving them a sense of dignity, but really also thinking about them as important pillars to what we're looking at today, whether it's development, creative industry, even food. Today's Europe multicultural cities are not multicultural because people are coming from different parts, but because they are indeed coming from different geographical locations. So as we move forward, I'm just wondering the space in which we can enhance this conversation within the space of the AU-EU partnership, for example, but that extends also to other regions where Europe continues to interact in terms of trade and development. And really happy, I'm from the African Non-State Actors Platform. We bring together migration actors, civil society, and trade unions, looking at migration and sustainable development, and really talking about the importance of focusing on people from either regions for us to really foster development. So really happy to also share some initiatives in other platforms from the African perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comment. And it's really important. And I think it's exactly what we're trying to do with this type of space of discussion. And again, digital, because, there is no so many ways to gather so many people from different places around one conversation. So really, as a concluding word, I would say that, what we see is that there is the desire for international cultural relations. There is desire, there is will, there is also the reality of it. So the connections between people are established. As you said, people-to-people relations in cultural cooperation are there, really. It's about being mindful of what is there, knowing how to observe what's happening in the field, because it can go really fast. We talked about, the digitalization of the CCIs. It's changing things a lot, but people adapt as well really fast. So it's also about, if you are at the policy level, anticipating the trends and being observant of what's happening. But at the end, the good thing is that there is a community, both from civil society and academia as well there to support, observe, and analyze. And I think, that's what we saw today in presenting the handbook, the EU as a Global Cultural Power, coordinated by Mafalda with Avril, Andrew, Alessandro, Matina. We see that, you have experts in the field able to connect the practice with its interpretation. So again, I would like to say really thank you to the panelists and all the participants for being, so present during that webinar. As I say, it's all been recorded, and obviously there's still a ton of questions to ask, but we'll keep that conversation going. Feel free to reach out if you have any other follow-up questions. And yes, thank you so much.
Thank you to Mafalda as well for doing all this work.
Thank you, Mafalda.
Thank you.
Yeah, big
Thank you,
contribution
everyone.
again for the handbook. Thank you, everyone.